Star Wars: The Old Republic, an EA-published MMO developed by BioWare and maintained by Broadsword. For those of you who were around here during the first lockdown of the pandemic, you'll probably remember I shat out a lot of SWTOR videos for some reason. And that same group of you probably remember I came to the conclusion trying to make SWTOR content wasn't really fun for me. But while playing the game to make content on it wasn't fun, I still do have a lot of love for the game and its characters even today, as I do still play it in my free time. Given I just also beaten Knights of the Old Republic games as well, my love for this era of Star Wars has sort of been renewed in a way. And since I am a Star Wars fan, there's nothing I love more to do than share my opinions of Star Wars online when nobody asks me to. Oh, and if r/SWTOR the creator watching, hi guys, hope you hate this. So here's my tier list ranking of all KOTOR and SWTOR companions. The tiers we have are as follows: S rank, A rank, B rank, C rank, and the KOF rank. You'll see why soon enough. Right, so to start from the beginning, we have the KOTOR companions to go off first. Carth. A loyal soldier, freedom until the end. Not that there's a problem with that. In the first KOTOR game, the first face you actually meet is Carth, and he sticks by you until the end of the game. As a character, his main arc revolves around getting the answers out of Sol Karath. And while there is a criticism of him for not immediately revealing the player character is actually Revan upon finding out, his approach to it, at least in my opinion, isn't unreasonable. The one downside he really has on the surface is I'm not the biggest fan of his romance if you decide to play as a female Revan, but then again, when has romance dialogue in Star Wars ever been good? All in all, the first person you ever meet in this era, Carth's a good one, but I do think some later companions outshine him due to the fact they appear later on in KOTOR 2, and their impact 300 years later in SWTOR is more significantly felt. But he's still going in A tier because his story does conclude within the context of the original KOTOR. S tier, I don't think I need to elaborate. So, as far as Twi'lek main characters go, I like Mission, and her backstory is interesting while not being overly flashy. Helping Zane Carrick rescue kidnapped children from the future swoop gang leader Brejik, and by the time we meet her in game, she's shown kindness towards the exiled Wookiee Zalbar. I understand there are people out there who don't like Mission on a part of her being an annoying child, but I just don't find that to be the case personally. Given the general tone of the game and how mature the story can get at times, Mission helps slightly to serve as bubbly contrast. Also, she's fucking 14 by the time the game starts, and she is helping to fight a space wizard empire along with several war criminals. This kid is a badass. B tier because I have a quota of bullying children to meet in this video. Zalbar's a big fucking teddy bear, but a loyal one at that, and I do appreciate having him around in a playthrough. His whole arc on Kashyyyk was fairly interesting as far as I'm concerned, but in being a big teddy bear, he has one notable flaw, in that not saying no to you is not easy for him. And to the point where the game reaches its final acts, you can straight up order him to kill Mission, the first person who ever showed him kindness after his exile. Though this will come back to bite you in the end if you choose to spare him following this order. I'd simply just have preferred a joint boss fight against Mission and Zalbar instead of a short-lived fight on the Starforge later.
I am not stuck up.
Yes, you are. I think Basra is indeed a pompous prick, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't warm up to her over the course of my playthroughs. And I imagine that was probably part of the intention of Basra's character arc. She becomes more likeable over the course of the game, and I'd be lying if part of me didn't find her romance dialogue in the late game to be relatively sweet and heartwarming, even if the timing of her love confession is a little poorly timed given the context of the situation. A tier. Now, Canderous is where we start getting to the real meat of some of these opinions, mainly because Canderous' story stretches far beyond the confines of just the first KOTOR, as much like T3 in HK47, he returns in the sequel as Mandalore the Preserver, as well as his actions having a later effect in SWTOR nearly 300 years later. Canderous is witty, a veteran of the Mandalorian Wars, turned enforcer for Kalo Nord at the start of the game. And while the small arc he has throughout the first KOTOR game was minimal and satisfying, the Legends novel Revan really shines a spotlight on him, as he is the only one of the main companions of the original game who accompanied Revan in T7 on the journey to find out more about the true Sith. During this time we learn about Canderous' clan, Clan Ordo, one that lives on years later. Oh, and meets his wife. Which means Canderous did the one thing no SWTOR player will ever do and talk to a real woman. When he returns in KOTOR 2, while he does fall into Krea's manipulation, he still remains firm in his desire to reunite the Mandalorian clans like his predecessor Mandalore the Ultimate did. A tier because I am biased. So I know a lot of people are fans of Zerka's best assassin droid, and I am also one of them. HK as a character is pretty damn interesting, being a special assassin droid built by Revan himself to take out special targets. Now the HK series is a staple of the Zerka Corporation, but HK-47 is unique, being the only non-Zerka HK droid. HK-47 may not be the most powerful HK in the Old Republic games, I'd argue HK-55 is deserving of that title, but what it lacks in power it makes up for in efficiency and longevity. For those of you who may played the base game content of SWTOR, you may also know what I mean by this. Bear in mind SWTOR takes place over 300 years after the events of Knights of the Old Republic 2. HK-47 managed to survive all 300 years and still remain a formidable threat, as it appears in two flashpoints as sort of the midway boss fight in them, once in the Foundry and the next in the False Emperor. I will say I prefer the Foundry version of the fight to the False Emperor one, and there is one other thing that makes HK-47 better than its two contemporaries from SWTOR, and that's something it says prior to the events of KOTOR. When Darth Malak asked the droid what he thought of him, HK-47 responded by calling Malak a meatbag. Revan apparently found this so funny, he mandated all HK models to refer to organics as such. I'll put HK-47 in A tier now, purely because of how it's presented after the Foundry in SWTOR. Its next 3 appearances in the whole game don't really provide any gravity to the character who in the same game outlined its mathematical way of committing genocide at the behest of Revan. Juhani is actually fairly interesting for the brief time she happens to be relevant in the main story, being a Jedi Padawan who fell to the dark side at the peak of her trials, and her later conversations, should you manage to recruit her that is. But she doesn't really get much relevancy whether or not you're doing a light or dark side playthrough once you begin to reach the halfway point of the story, unless you choose to romance her. Speaking of which, she's also a lesbian character in early 2000s gaming, which is fairly cool if you ask me. C tier. I'll be honest, the same reasons I put Juhani in C tier can also be applied to Jolee. He's by far one of the better Jedi companions between both KOTOR games, but his lack of overall relevancy in the main story outside of when you meet him really stops me from placing him higher, though his sense of humour is something I can certainly get behind. C tier. Hey everyone, this is a post-recording thing from me. I want to apologise for this video being very much uploaded at the 11th hour. I got very sick when I was originally supposed to be recording this with tonsillitis, and then I had a bunch of coursework to get done, so I had to put a lot of stuff off, and I'm kind of rushing this part out. This was going to be one massive video, but that has not been the case. I will also try and finish what I had originally planned for this month instead, and I'll just release each section in parts, as if it was all one cohesive video, just to save myself time now, so I can get something out for literally the end of February. So, yeah. If you've seen part 1, then you know how this goes. You've got S through to Kof tiers. Last time we did KOTOR 1, this time we're doing KOTOR 2. Mandalore T3 and HK-47 were already covered in part 1, so go watch that for their rankings. With that out of the way, let's get this show on the road. There are plenty of video essays on this website that deconstruct and analyze Krea. I'd highly recommend these videos by Ansul Matul, as I think their two different perspectives are as equally valid as they are interesting. But to try and briefly give my thoughts on this character, given that giving my opinions is the whole point of these videos, Krea to me embodies the core beats of KOTOR 2. In fact, given KOTOR 2's contrast to the original, Krea does serve as the mouthpiece to the deconstruction of Star Wars that the game presents. You are allowed to see that as Preachy, the lead writer for this game, is not exactly a flawless man. Elements of her can be seen in a couple of other characters in modern Star Wars, namely Luke from The Last Jedi and Baylan Skoll from the Ahsoka show, with both being disillusioned with the Jedi Order as a whole and deciding it ought to remain a relic of the past. though Balin takes a much more destructive path as a result of that belief, which is more akin to Kreia. Whether or not these two characterizations were inspired by Kreia, or just so happen to be coincidences, can be up to interpretation unless Johnson or Filoni explicitly state otherwise. Either way, without turning this segment into a video essay of its own, trust me, I have a full video about KOTOR's relevance to modern Star Wars planned for the future. Kreia is an important character who plays her role in the deconstructive narrative of the game extremely well, and it's hard for me not to appreciate a character, especially with the level of voice acting quality that you get for her. I could say a lot of things about Atton, both negative, positive, and downright childish, but for time's sake I'll try and make this briefer than the previous bit. So Atton's story is interesting to me, but I feel like it misses a few key story beats that could have been further expanded on. Though I imagine this is the result of the final product of KOTOR 2 being absolutely gutted content-wise. The restored mod does help Atton's story, in fact it helps everyone's stories a bit. The canonicity of it is debatable, and even then the mod doesn't fully restore all lost content. So... right, now back to Atton. I do genuinely believe Atton's background and story is interesting, although the whole killing the Jedi that showed him the Force out of love thing isn't good writing, as it tries too hard to make him sympathetic. And Atton is sympathetic, but that one detail pushes the line from, wow, I feel bad for him and see why he is the way he is now, to, Lamau, this guy is fucking cringe. Though, albeit for a game, Atton is genuinely quite fun to have around, and his personality helps contrast Kreia really well. Which, trust me, it's needed, because otherwise this game would be way worse if there was never any contrast to Kreia. So thank you, Atton. Something else about Atton I didn't mention is... wait, we're on Bao-Dur now? I've got Jag Diddley Scott written from that isn't a synopsis of what the mass shadow generator is. Alright, no problem. I can improvise. Okay, that is being a bit harsh on Bao-Dur, as out of everything that not even the restored content mod team were able to do, Bao-Dur is not given nearly as much screen time as he deserves. Who he is, his relationship to the player, and what he's doing when you meet him are, and I cannot stress this enough, massively important to not only the game's narrative and background, but also that of KOTOR 1 and even SWTOR, a game which happens 300 years after this one. I said last time that Juhani and Jolie Bindo didn't get enough screen time despite their interesting stories. At least we kind of get to hear those stories, even if they aren't explored for any gameplay or main plot elements after they become companions. But holy fuck, saying Bao-Dur somehow got the shorter end of the same short stick is a massive understatement. Now, I really do like Bao-Dur. The interactions you get with him are genuinely interesting, and you can really tell he's a man who regrets his actions and is willing to do whatever he can to atone for his sins in the Mandalorian Wars. Also, his remote is a brave little droid, so at least he's not lost everything to the game's cut content. A tier purely because what we have left of Bao-Dur's original content is genuinely brilliant. I get a lot of feeling people don't actually like Brianna. Hell, I know someone who downright hates her. I, however, don't really have much of a major opinion on Brianna, though I will give her endgame character arc when she finally reveals her name to the player and standing her ground against her sisters, big props. Most of Brianna's development only occurs in dialogue with her on the Ebon Hawk, and very little in the main game provides her with much to say. In fact, she tends to focus mainly on Atris and the player's relationship. However you choose to view that relationship, and Atris' choice of telling Brianna specifically to become your companion can be up to interpretation, and I tend to lean back and forth on whether said relationship is romantic or platonic. But despite Brianna's development only happening in pure dialogue scenes, the screen time she gets in the game's final act really gives her a chance to shine.
I hope your thoughts in this matter are clear. In saving her, you may destroy yourself, and do not mate with her. Whatever you may feel, whatever urges consume you, do not let them control you. Such a union would breed difficulties. We shall see.
Oh, fine, I'll get on with the ranking. So, Thesis. Yeah, I feel like she's a pretty good character. What, you wanted more than that? Okay, I'll do this properly. Okay, Visas, in my opinion, is a slightly better version of Brianna. Regardless of how you view the relationship the Aesop can have with any one of their companions, there's a pretty strong argument to be made that Visas is in love with the exile regardless of their gender. There are 3 scenes in Visas' stories we see in-game that stick out to me personally. The main one being her introduction to the Exile. When I first played KOTOR 2, I wasn't familiar with Visas' character. I knew she was in the game and that she was a Miraluka, but I knew nothing of her character or story. When she introduces herself to the Exile, I immediately wanted to know more about her. And luckily, her story isn't all that gutted by the cut content, and I remember finding myself really emotionally invested in her story. Unfortunately, Visas does have her flaws, specifically with her dialogue. And one of the other key scenes that sticks out to me, which is one a lot of people consider to be emotion porn, whether intentional or not, a lot of Visas' dialogue was uncomfortable to sit through at points, and this emotion porn scene still felt out of the blue given her character progression up until this point. So I imagine she wasn't even immune to the cut content of the game. No, I do not like you. Look, I know I've gone on and on about cut content really gutting a lot of characters in this game, but Goto has nothing that makes me interested in him. There's an interesting premise behind the character, but there really is just no meat to the character if you ask me, and I sometimes forget he's even in the game. I'm sorry Goto, but you've got the privilege of being the first one to go in the cough tier. Mira is a character in the middle ground for me. Like all other companions featured in the game, she's got an interesting backstory, though luckily the important parts of her character arc managed to remain fully intact by the looks of things. I definitely wouldn't say I find Mira uninteresting. In fact, her more cheery personality is very much appreciated when you consider the generally dark tone of the game and tragedy surrounding everyone in it, including her. Her story feels like a very said and done thing to me, and she doesn't have any major moments or qualities that make her stand out overall. Now, originally when I was writing this script for this video, I found a ranked list of the KOTOR 2 companions on GameRant. Now, I could make a valid critique of Hanha. I dislike the way the article portrayed him so much, I'm putting in an A tier just to be spiteful. So, Mikkel's the inverse of Brianna, given without any content restoration mods, Mikkel is exclusive to the female exile. I know I'm probably repeating something everyone who's played a female exile has said, but Mikkel is a precious being. I really can't help but like this guy. His backstory, while not as interesting or in-depth as many of the other companions in-game, hell, even though he's functionally Brianna's counterpart, he perhaps doesn't have as deep as a character as she does. But he's just so goddamn lovable. So I've eventually got around to fulfilling the promise I made in February. So this one's going to be split into two parts, with the next part containing companions unique to the major expansions of the game, and this one just including the ones that you find in the class stories. Either way, if you've seen the last two videos, you know how the ranking system works. Time to get to work. I feel inappropriately dressed for this one. Give me 1 minute, fellas. Okay, this feels better. Right, now time to start for real. T7 goes on S-tip, and I won't explain myself because it should be obvious by now that I have a bias to these kinds of companions. Right, so right out the door, I have one problem with Kira, and that's her outfit. Out of all the companions, anytime I gain Kira as one in the Jedi Knight story, I immediately give her a better outfit to wear. But pettiness about cosmetics aside, I do like Kira. Both with and without her romance option, a lot of the first chapter focuses on this character, which proves to make her interesting, and given the Jedi Knight storyline is the closest continuation to the KOTOR games, Kira manages to fit well with other companions from Knights of the Old Republic, namely Bastila and Cuff. She's a character who remains relevant for all of her screen time in the main story, and her solo companion missions are very engaging, And the final companion mission for her always sticks out in my head. It's pretty rare for the game to actively state to your face you don't get a say in the outcome of it. She's also voiced by Laura Bailey, who I am willing to bet you've heard her voice at some point in your life before. So the voice acting for Kira is top notch to say the least. The main downside I have with Kira is her return in the Onslaught expansion, where she's just as important as before, but she seems to have lost the charm that made her such an enjoyable companion in the class story, unless you choose to romance her for some reason, which even if you're playing as a Jedi Knight who didn't romance her is kind of annoying, given it's not like she wasn't dealing with any trauma in the class story at all. With that in mind, Kira barely doesn't make S tier, but I'm putting her in A tier due to how much I liked having her around in the class story. Okay, I'm not going to try and spend too much time on Doc, but it's important to know I don't like the guy. He's the only romance option for a female knight, and that's it. In fact, Doc has two stories running together, him wanting to be recognised for his medical work, which is a very noble desire when you consider he's potentially one of the best field medics out there. But this is overshadowed by one key factor. He's a fuckboy. I mean, the proper word is womanizer, but I couldn't get the rights for the song to make that joke. Doc's second story isn't touched on much if you choose not to romance him or happen to play a male knight. But even if you don't romance him as a female knight, his advances are uncomfortable. Hell, if you have Kira with you when you meet him, even she's made uncomfortable by him. Whenever I think of Dog, I'm reminded of one scene where you end up in a holocaust with his ex, where you find out he didn't even show up to the wedding, and his response just boiled down to, "I don't get why you believed I'd show up, get over it." So yeah, Dog never really left a good impression on me. C tier. I think it's telling that when I think of Rusk, I think of his recruitment mission in Knights of the Fallen Empire, where he can become a companion to everyone, rather than just the class story he's relevant from. In the last video I said one of the problems I had with Goto was that he was easily forgettable, and Rusk is exactly the same in the regard of how forgettable he is. But unlike Goto, he's got no real redeeming qualities in terms of character or story, so into the cough tier he goes. So Scourge, in my opinion, is possibly one of the more interesting companions in the game. In fact, he's just an interesting case of a companion in the game, given he is one of the oldest characters in the game, being over 300 years old. And if that number sounds familiar to you, then it should be, because in the timeline, the Knights of the Old Republic games happened 300 years before SWTOR did, and Scourge's story extends that far back, of course, making an appearance as a tertiary protagonist in the Revan novel, which I'd recommend reading if you'd like to know what Revan was up to after the first KOTOR game. It's a shame Mitra isn't given much of a character in the novel, but I'm also glad it wasn't written by Chris Avalon. But Scourge plays a large role in the final act of the Jedi Knight story, and even accidentally plays a role in the Sith Warrior storyline to a minor degree. Being a straight up Sith, as well as a pretty fucking high ranking one at that, Scourge offers a unique perspective to the options a Jedi Knight gets in dialogue with him. In fact, his immortality brings him a lack of emotions, sort of making him an anti-Sith in a way. And his interactions give us an interesting insight on Sith culture outside of the constant infighting and Jedi hating presented within the game. It is, however, ultimately a shame he doesn't play any major role in the expansions outside of his return with Kira in Onslaught, but what screen time he has there, especially if you're playing as a Sith Warrior, brought a cheeky smile to my face, seeing him redeem himself in a way and all. So he's going in S tier. Look, I'm going to get this out of the way now. I really don't like the Consular story, like, at all. There are plenty of things story-wise in the game that I can critique, but I hold the Consular story in the lowest regard out of everything in the game. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if this was the last of the class stories to be written, and the writers for the game were simply suffering burnout, and that's why it ended up being as bad as it is. And my dislike of this class story extends to the companions as well. I find all of them either outright bad or simply plain boring. Unfortunately for me, I don't find their stories engaging, and have ever only played through the Consular story twice as a result of this. So to save myself both time and you lot a long-winded rant, I'm going to do us all a favour, put each character in the cough tier and quickly highlight their biggest issues each. Kaizen Fest, lost potential and boring character missions. Theron Cadrex, this man is simultaneously a womanizer and an incel. Holiday is that VTuber that Theron is in love with. But But Revolution, oh my god, shut the fuck up. Have a nuanced opinion about literally anything else, please. Lost potential and just plain boring. Nadia, oh god. Look, she may canonically be in her early 20s, but she's absolutely jailbait, and I'm not comfortable with the fact that she's the only male consular romance option. Oh, and she's boring as well. There, done. Let us hope I never have to touch the consular storyline again, Jesus fucking Christ. You know, no smuggler would be caught dead wearing Jedi robes. Give me another minute. Not my usual style, but hey, it works. Sam! That sums up Kotor, especially if you're playing as a female smuggler. He doesn't get much of a character arc when he's the only character that gives you companion quests. The problem is that Kotor's desire to be an idealistic hero remains prevalent. While I get that out of all of the last stories, the smuggler kind of obviously does contain the most comic relief. Unlike other companions, Kotor borders on parody of the small town hero, and if there's one trait that almost proves he's a parody is, well, sexism. Normally I put him in the same category as both Doc and Theron for that. One thing that's clear about all those characters is their sexism is played up for laughs. Theron has developed a weirdly sexual relationship with Holiday, who herself is weirdly sexual about Theron, and he admits he had tinkered with her AI before they met the Jedi Consul, so his weird fetish is more than implied rather than outwardly stated to be true. And he at least seems to reform himself by the time we see him post-Onslaught. If you're able to put up with him, you can help Doc change his ways over the course of the Jedi Knight storyline as well. Kotor never really gets such a redemption, as it were. Even when he returns after the Eternal Throne expansion and having spent the last 5 years with Risha, he doesn't seem to change. There's no mission or conversation you can have where he realizes that his idealistic old world values aren't going to help him in the galactic underworld or a galaxy at war. He remains the exact same, and even once you've beat the Smuggler storyline, even if you chose the dark side ending, seems to remain the most ignorant and oblivious companion I have ever met in this game. I was going to put him in C tier, but when writing this part of the script I realised how little I actually liked him, so he's going in the cough tier. I mean, come on. You're telling me the Smuggler story, where your ship looks like a prototype Millennium Falcon, wasn't going to give you a Wookiee companion? Bodar in a way is the mix of Zalbar and Chewbacca, if you to ask me. It's how I describe it, at least. His life debt is the topic of many conversations you have with him, and his witty comments made during main story cutscenes definitely reflects his will to not be a slave again. His arc about tracking down the Trandoshans that sold him into slavery was nice, but ultimately there's not much more to this Wookiee story. His one major downside, as you ask me, his recruitment mission in the Fallen Empire expansion isn't really that fun. I don't like doing the Eternal Championship anytime it comes to recruiting him, but I like being able to have all the companions at my disposal, so I have to put up with it, so B tier for that. Risha, I'd argue, is probably the most interesting of the Smuggler's companions. It helps her case that her story is also linked with the first chapter of the class story as well. For context, her full name is Risha Drain, and she's a descendant of royalty. Originally making a deal with Skavok, she chooses to work for the player instead once it's cleared up that she can make you extremely rich, and the ship you're on actually belongs to you. Essentially, the first chapter changes from you chasing Skavok to working for Risha so she can claim her ancestors' fortune and hopefully find a way to take over her homeworld of Jabrillion. The second part of which is the main focus of her companion conversations after she agrees to keep travelling with you following chapter 1. Risha is arguably the most knowledgeable of the galactic underworld, and she plays this to her advantage as well as your own throughout the course of the Smuggler storyline. And out of all the companions in the base game, I'd argue she's definitely the most level-headed one there is. A tier. I'd argue Akavi's conversations can fall into a similar place that Bodar's do. Given she is a Mandalorian, she actually presents a very interesting dynamic to the rest of the crew, as she's a lot more stern, is the only one with a strict code of honour to follow. The closest to that is Bodar, but that's solely with his life debt to the player. For the most part, Akavi's story is primarily completed in the main story on Balmora, and the follow-up in companion conversations about tracking down her former lover for even more revenge seemed a little unnecessary to me, but I do understand that continuing that story after she becomes a companion was narratively easier to write, and luckily this character's been getting a lot more love recently thanks to her being a Mandalorian and all. With the Mando stuff the game's been throwing at us in recent, it's nice to see a class story companion get more screen time. B tier. Now I'm gonna get this one out of the way very quickly. Gus is going to go in C tier. And that's not because I dislike the character, far from it, but much like Rusk, he's very easily forgotten, even if he is a funny character. But he doesn't really have much substance outside of being the main comic relief companion in the storyline. I've done the getting changed joke twice now, just know I've got an outfit for all the classes that I'm going to use. I remember not liking Jorgen at first, but this is one of those characters that grows on you, just as you, the player, grow on him. Jorgen was stuck on Ord Mantell for ages, and if you played the Smuggler storyline, you know how much of a shithole that planet is. Only for him to be demoted for something he had no control over and end up under the command of the player. I'd be pretty fucking pissed about that if I was in his place. Luckily, Jorgen softens tone towards the player over time, and out of all 5 companions in the Trooper storyline, he's one of the 2 that doesn't bend over backwards for the player, especially if your Trooper is playing a total loyalist. On top of that, his companion missions stand out to me, as it really does show you the depths of which the Republic can sink to at times. It really shows how hard the Empire is in the Republic, and that they may not be too dissimilar. A tier. You know what I was saying about the Empire and Republic not being too dissimilar? Dawn being an Imperial defector actually helps highlight that. She doesn't have any companion missions the same way Jorgen does to show off the corruption of the Republic. She does highlight how the Imperial military functions in comparison to the propaganda. And she probably has my second favourite romance on the Republic side on top of that. And her arc about no longer being held back by what is essentially the Foreign Office, because it's as competent as the real thing, is actually quite fun to watch. So yeah, Dawn goes in A tier. Right, so I'm going to do the same thing I did with the Consular Companions, where I lost 3 Trooper Companions, because they all fall into the C tier for me, and they really only have one specific thing that stands out. So let's just move quickly. M14X. I like droids as much as the next guy, but the overwhelming patriotism does eventually become annoying. It's a shame we'll never see Tanovic again due to his voice actor having passed away, but he's got a neat backstory and it's always nice to have a little scum around for company. Yun is a bug man. I don't know where I was going with this. He's got a likeable personality, so he's got that going for him. What? I literally cosplayed a Sith for Halloween. These people have cookies. We're on the Sith Warrior companions now, so expect a fuck ton of bias in these ones. So like every other starting companion, you meet Vet on the starter planet for the class story. But unlike other classes where you have to work with them almost from the get-go, Vet and one other companion are forced to work with you, the player. During my first playthrough, Vet wasn't what I expected for the starting companion for a Sith, but I kinda like it, all things considered. Vet could easily fit in as part of the Smuggler crew, and she nearly could have lore-wise given she was Rish's childhood friend. So it was nice to inject some of that cheesiness into the Sith Warrior storyline, especially given the odd comedic moments the crew can have here. Vet fits just right in with the rest of the Misfit Warrior crew. Plus, while her story arc with her companion missions isn't the most engaging out there, it was nice to see a companion be deeply affected by the actions you make during their quests. Unfortunately, a lot of what made Vet a fun character in the class story is lost in the Zakul expansions. Probably as a result of how massive the main cast of those expansions was. So she didn't really get enough screen time outside of interactions with a Sith Warrior to live up to what she used to be, so B tier unfortunately. Quinn is an Imperial officer. That's it. Hold on. He's a pawn of Barras, and there's not much else to it. Having an Imperial officer as part of the crew makes sense, but I'll be honest, I can't say I'm unsurprised by the general lack of engaging personality to the character. He is, however, saved by his appearance in the War for Iocath, where you can really tell he's grown as a character and developed a bit more of a personality. Iocath saves him from the Koth tier and gets him safely into C tier. So there's 2 versions of Jacer, and I'm going to rank them separately for the sake of them behaving like 2 different characters. Light-sided Jacer is probably my favourite out of the 2. She may have defected from the Jedi, but she is still a young Padawan trying to find her way through the galaxy, and she complements a grey or light-sided Sith Warrior really well as an apprentice. Even though I get the feeling that we're unlikely to see either of Jacer again in the future, her return in Jedi Under Siege actually managed to catch me off guard, so I was really happy to see her again. I would put her in S tier for the class story, but unfortunately her ultimate lack of relevance after the first chapter keeps her out of it and lowers her into A tier. Don't stick your dick in crazy, that's all I'm gonna say here. Darkseid Jacer goes into C tier because at least the crazy keeps her interesting. Pierce is one of the best warrior companions if you ask me. He's charismatic and having a Black Ops trooper really sells how important of a Sith Lord your character is. Bringing his squad back together to take the Bastion is a really neat storyline and a good example of how intertwined the class stories really are, given how retaking the Bastion is a key part of the trooper storyline. B tier. Brunemark is a said and done character. He's got a semi-interesting background and the fact you work with him on Hoth out of a shared necessity. He is fun, but his companion conversations aren't massively interesting to me. But he's not unlikable, nor does he suffer any major flaws. So in my opinion, he goes into C tier. The shards are super fucking interesting and it's flat out criminal that it isn't explored further with him as a companion. But I'm happy to settle for him as a lore master about Tulak Horde. I'm a bit of a slut for information, so having Kem Val around to just feed me lore information I crave I absolutely love. Plus the little problem he has for the majority of the class story was pretty interesting to watch unfold. A tier. Darth Zash is Kem Val's problem. She plays into the lore master aspect of Kem Val, and making fun of her is honestly my favourite part of interacting with her. I always make sure to purge her from Kem Val at the end of the class story because her reaction that you're killing her off is always amusing. She goes into B tier because she's just not as good as Kem Val is. Man, I'm only just now realising that Sith classes don't really have brilliant romance options outside of expansions, huh? Oh right, we're on Andronicus. He's a pretty fun companion to have about. He takes up the same spot as Quinn does, acting as your ship's pilot, but unlike Quinn, Andronicus is a former pirate captain, so he's got a lot of charisma to go with him. While I can't say anything notable about his character arc, it's a revenge story. It's a bit of a shame we don't actually get to go through those companion missions with him, because playing through his revenge arc at least would be fun if you ask me. B tier. And I'll be honest, Ashara is interesting to manipulate while you're on Taris, but when she's your companion, I can't help but find her to be an annoying version of light-sided Jacer. Weirdly enough, she's a bit like Corso with her lack of actual character development. Throughout her story arc, she remains naive and doesn't really seem to learn anything throughout the conversations you have with her. C tier. Hail Talos! Wait, this is SWTOR, not Skyrim. Oh. The Sith Inquisitor storyline is a very well put together lore dump for idiots like me. Talos being part of the Imperial Reclamation fits right into that. If I were going to enlist for the Imperial military, I'd enlist for Reclamation thanks to Talos selling it so well to me. Talos goes in B tier. Zalek is introduced too late into the class story to have a chance to be interesting. The only main thing he's got going for him is that he admires his dad, but not much else due to the lack of time left to develop him over the course of the story. But at least he's not bad, just a victim of circumstance, so he goes into C tier.
So, with Mako, I'm aware of two things I should probably mention. First is that I can't accuse Nadia of being jailbait despite her being in her 20s, when Mako is 17, making her actual jailbait. So, yeah, she's actual jailbait, I'm gonna get that out of the way, because she's the only male bounty hunter romance in the class story, which is, quite frankly, ugh. I don't know who the hell was writing that, but did no one think to double check it, is all I'm saying. And second, I'm aware she is annoying. And all of that aside, I do want to try and at least focus on some of the positive aspects that there are to this character, so we'll do that. If you choose to see Mako as a little sister character like that one dialogue option outright states, she's actually an alright character to have around. Now, unlike other naive companions in the game, I kind of appreciate that she does grow. She does benefit from being the first companion in the Bounty Hunter storyline, but also Corso was the first companion in the Smuggler storyline and he remained naive throughout. You can tell I don't like Corso, can you? It's a shame that her arc ends on a confusing note and it's not really ever picked back up. Not to mention, her whole story conflicts with the main class story with the whole SIS involvement, which is another shame altogether. Ultimately, I'm gonna be honest, Mako's nothing to write home about, so she's going into C tier. A tier, A tier, A tier. Gold needs no explanation. He's the most consistent companion in-game, and I always smile when he's on screen. Torian is the female bounty hunter romance option. Much like Mako, he's also 17. Can you tell that there are concerning oversights in this game that bother me? So, a lot about what I said about Akavi in regards to being a Mandalorian earlier can also be attributed to Torian. If your bounty hunter is Mandalorian, then it's neat for him to teach you about Mandalorian culture. If you're not a Mando, then it's nice to have a differing perspective to everyone else and the player character itself. B tier. A tier. Same reasons T7 and T3 ended up in S tier. I know a lot of people really don't like Scourge on account of him being a complete scumbag, to which I can understand. He's definitely not a nuanced character by any stretch of the imagination. He's a total psychopath, but arguably the fact he's so extra about the fact he's a murdering psychopath is pretty funny. Though I'll admit, outside of his comic relief and being generally funny, there's not really much more to him other than that, so C tier.
Kaleo is probably one of the least interesting Imperial Agent companions, and that's purely just because the other companions in this story are so varied and interesting in terms of story and lore. But being the average uni student in the UK myself, I'm a big fan of Little Anarchy, so I really vibe with Kaleo's work. But it's very interesting to see the way Kaleo does things. She's not a believer in the course of anarchy, but she simply enjoys the chaos. While her romance does come across as pretty bland to me, her arc really does intrigue me as to what other failings Imperial Intelligence was having that we couldn't see throughout the main story. B tier, but no, it's a high B tier. Not a fan of Vector's personality, but the Bugman is admittedly very interesting. But I do find it highly amusing that when he was a diplomat, he was living in luxury on Alderaan with a noble house and went, nah, I want to live with the bugs, and then became an Imperial diplomat for an entirely separate faction on the planet that doesn't even have a stake in the Civil War. But he goes in B tier. I hate Rackles, I hate Rackles, I hate Rackles! Sorry, just had to get that out of my system. I like Loken's concept. I wish we got to see more of him as a mentor type character, as he's the only other member of Imperial Intelligence outside of the player and the crew. But his arc about his past and the involvement of his research really intrigues me, and the Incredible Hulk thing he's got going on really should have been expanded further upon. But dear God, I hate his recruitment mission in the Fallen Emperor expansion beta. Reyna's arc is what I wish more of the Inquisitor's interactions with Zalek were like, being able to train someone up from scratch. Reyna may not have any mage development, but it's nice to just give her some lessons as some of her companion conversations rather than just have her talk at you about random bits of her past. Not that her past isn't interesting, of course. A non-Chiss Force user amongst the Chiss Ascendancy is something I really think, while not explored in full, really helps Reyna to be a memorable character. Beat it. Fuck you. Scorpio is by far one of the most interesting companions in the entire game. The air of mystery around her and her major involvement in the Zakul expansions is very well done to help answer that mystery. But Scorpio has one major problem. She is so fucking annoying to deal with. Now, while I've got nothing wrong with characters not bending over backwards for you, in fact I enjoy seeing it happen, there is a difference between an independent-minded character and a stubborn bitch. And Scorpio is a stubborn bitch. To the point I actually had to restart cutscenes with her in them because I'd begin to drown out whatever she was saying after a while. Straight into the Koth tier with you, Scorpio. So I can't fully put these into any set category as every class gets access to these companions, so I'm just going to quickly rank them here. C tier, interesting companion mission in the expansions. Only ever do it once per character though. C tier, fucking coward. Shriek is mainly all backstory, but hey, an Ewok companion. Plus Shriek's got some of the most customizations out of all the companions, so that's fun to mess around with at times. C tier. I'm extremely biased, so HK51 goes in beta. Oh, we're doing these ones as well. C tier.